Hi everyone, hope you've been well. Louis here from Ideas Matter, talking today about Philosophy and Real Politics by Raymond Geuss, which I have to say was just such a good read, like phenomenally good. It's clear, it's concise. I don't know about you, but I really like academic books that don't sort of lose themselves in academic jargon, and sometimes it feels like writers are just falling over themselves to prove that they've mastered the lingo of a particular discipline, and actually being clear communicators takes a backseat to them trying to prove how clever they are. Geuss does not do that at all. He's such a clear writer, and look how short it is. It's 100 pages. So if you're in the market for a very short and illuminating read about politics and the relationship between philosophy and politics, I could not recommend Raymond Geuss's Philosophy and Real Politics enough. An absolute 10 out of 10 read. So I'm going to explain what his argument is in this book. We'll go over it. So the structure that I'll follow in this video is, firstly, I'll follow the structure of the book, because again, it's just so logical. It's so clearly laid out. So I'll begin with the introduction. So summarizing the four arguments that he advances. Then we'll go into more depth in part one, which is called political realism. Then we'll do part two, and he gives examples of things that he thinks are failures of being realistic. So not failures of political realism, but failures to be realistic in politics. And then we'll cover briefly his conclusion about what he thinks politics actually is and how to do politics as a realist. So this hopefully will be a little bit shorter than the last video. So just to introduce, Geuss is a political theorist, political philosopher with very much an historical bent. So you may have heard of the Cambridge Texts in the History of Philosophy series. He co-edits that with Quentin Skinner, who's an intellectual historian. So Raymond Geuss is very much one of those political theorists who tries to view things in their historical context, which I very much appreciate. So in this book, he's outlining a school of thought in political theory called political realism. Now, political realism is probably best described by what it's arguing against. So he says from the get-go that he's arguing against the ethics-first reading of politics. And this is quite fortuitous for us because the previous video was about John Rawls and his theory of justice. And that's a great example of what an ethics-first approach to politics is. So really, what Rawls does and what other political philosophers do is when they want to study the world of politics, they begin with some sort of moral ideal, whatever moral ideal they take to be most politically important or salient. So freedom, happiness, autonomy, etc. They begin with that idea, and then they apply their philosophical training to elucidating that idea to get into the clearest conception of that moral idea. And then they go and apply that to the political world, and they make judgments about political systems or political actors depending upon how well those political systems instantiate the moral ideal that they take to be the most important. So Rawls is judging political systems by how well they instantiate his principles of justice as fairness. Socialists will do the same thing, or Marxists will do the same thing based on how well the political system instantiates freedom for the working class, for example, or abolishes alienation in the workplace, or what have you. So you begin with an ethical ideal, and then you go and look at the real world. Now, for Geuss, this gets the order completely the wrong way around. And so this is one of the first theses, one of the first arguments he's going to advance in Philosophy and Real Politics. And that is, political philosophy must be realist, which is to say that it must start from and be concerned with, to quote, the way the social, economic, political institutions actually operate in some society at some given time. So don't start with an abstract ideal and then try and look for that ideal being played out in society, but begin with the institutions, begin with the concrete. And secondly, and related from this, is that political philosophy ought to recognize that politics is about action. Primarily, it's about political action and the context that action takes place in. It's not about the beliefs and propositions we hold in our head. And he has a pretty strong claim about why he thinks politics is not primarily about beliefs and propositions. He says, quote, "People often have no determinate beliefs at all about a variety of subjects. They often don't know what they want or why they did something. Even when they know or claim to know what they want, they can often give no coherent account of why exactly what they claim to want, of why they want what they claim to want. And furthermore, any attempt to think seriously about the relation between politics and ethics must remain cognitively sensitive to the fact that people's beliefs, values, desires, moral conceptions, etc., are usually half-baked, are almost certain to be both indeterminate and grossly inconsistent." So this is a nice rejoinder, I think, to socialism and liberalism, both of which say that people are rational, or at least capable of being rational, and pursue their interests in a rational way. Geuss is saying that's just not the case, because people don't know what they want, and people don't know what they think about things. And yet, despite that indeterminacy of our beliefs, we still act. So if you're judging action by assuming that people are acting on well thought out reasons, you're not actually providing an accurate description of what's going on, according to Geuss. Maybe you disagree. But his third thesis that he's going to advance in this book is that politics is historically located. You can't talk about politics in general or ethics in general. You've got to talk about it in a specific context. Because remember, he says that politics is about action, and action is always taking place in an historical context. Certain forms of action make sense in certain contexts, but wouldn't make sense in others. This is sort of how I feel talking to socialists and Marxists on university campus, and one of them literally said to me that their model for political action was the Russian Revolution in 1918. And this is someone living in Australia in 2023. That just doesn't, for Geuss, who has Marxist leanings, and that would be an incoherent statement, because the forms of political action that took place in the Russian Revolution were historically located. They would not work in Australia in 2023 or in any other late capitalist liberal democratic society. So you have to observe politics historically. And lastly, he says that politics is the exercise of a craft or art. It's not the application of a theory. So good politicians have a skill. I mean, they're able to exercise political judgment. They're not ethical philosophers. They're not applying their learning from books to a political situation. They're judging the situation as it arises and then applying their skill at being political. So Geuss says that one of the hallmarks of having a skill is being able to apply it in new and uncertain circumstances. And so that's a good example of like a good politician can respond to things on the fly, can manipulate certain situations to get the outcome they want. So politics is more of a skill rather than the application of abstract theories, right? So they're the four theses that Geuss wants to advance in this book. So we'll move on now to part one. Part one, he goes into a bit more depth about how to do political realism as a methodology. And so he says quite explicitly from the start that he's continuing a tradition which he sees as beginning with Hobbes, or at least developing on a Hobbesian insight. And that is that anytime we have social coordination, anytime we have societies in which people are cooperating for a common good, we can't take that as a given. That's an achievement. That something actually has to be holding that together. And in holding society together, that's usually done at a cost. It's usually done at the threat of violence. And so realism begins from there. The first political question is not how ought we to live, what are the best ethical values, etc. It's how do we create political order? How do we create legitimacy? How do we create stability? They're the first political questions. And so from there, after that basic Hobbesian insight, as he calls it, he says there are three types of questions that a political realist asks, and he calls these the questions of Lenin, the questions of Nietzsche, and the questions of Max Weber. But the question of Lenin is the most important, and this is why towards the end of the book, Geuss calls himself a Neo-Leninist. And when he calls himself a Neo-Leninist, he doesn't mean that he agrees with anything that Lenin said about what politics should be, but he agrees with the method of how Lenin approaches politics because it's highly realistic. So, for example, the question of Lenin is whom? Sounds a bit vague. What does that mean? He says that politics is always about someone, a who, doing something to someone else. So who does what to whom is the first political question. And so to give an example of what he means by this and how it gives a more fruitful approach to politics, think about how we often hear really vague, abstract statements like unemployment rose by 3%. Right? That's a very impersonal way of talking about politics. But on this Leninist account, you would reframe that and say, well, what that actually means is that someone with economic power fired other people. So politics is always about those with power exercising that power to affect other people. It's not about these abstract impersonal forces. It's quite concrete. It's people doing things to other people. So Geuss says that this is the most important question we can ask of politics, but he thinks that we should extend it a little bit. So he reframes it as who does what to whom for whose benefit. That question for him is the best place to begin when you want to understand politics in a given society. And he extends it a little bit further by saying we should also be attentive to who could do what for whose benefit, because sometimes political power works by intimidation. It doesn't actually have to be exercised. The mere knowledge that someone could exercise power over you is enough to make you comply. It doesn't actually have to be exercised. So who does what to whom for whose benefit, and who could do what to whom for whose benefit? That's the primary political question for Geuss. The second question is the question of Nietzsche. And that really is that we need to understand politics, to use an economist's term, as an opportunity cost. We don't make a political choice in a vacuum. We don't just choose A. We're always choosing something over something else. So this is Nietzschean in the sense that Nietzsche thinks that all human judgment is evaluative. We're always saying this is better than that. So we choose A over B. And this has political consequences, Geuss thinks, because, well, A, we're exercising an evaluative judgment about why one course of action is better than another. But secondly, this involves a question of timing and priorities. When we choose to do A before B or rather than B, even if we go and do B later, the fact that we did A first is going to have important consequences, and it's going to change the situation. So it doesn't make much of a difference, for example, that the United States recently withdrew from Afghanistan because they went in the first place. And so that them going into Afghanistan, whether you think it was good or bad is not the point, irrevocably changed the situation. And even if the United States withdraws later, the political situation has been changed for good. So the timing of political decisions is very, very salient for Geuss. And he connects this with his earlier point about politics being a skill, right? So he says the importance of political timing is very, very acute if you think that politics presents you windows of opportunity that might not present themselves again. And a skillful politician can judge what is politically feasible at a certain point in time, or when might be the only opportunity to advance a certain agenda that they might not be able to advance in the future. And he makes an interesting point about progressives. Progressives tend to think that history's on their side. And so if they fail politically now, that's okay, because it will be easier next time, because in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, the historical conditions will be more favourable to a progressive approach to politics. He's very, very sceptical of that. So am I. And I think this might be an interesting way of looking at why conservatives are sometimes more politically adept and adroit than progressives, because they don't think history is on their side. They need to act now. And if we just look at recent history, so we look at the aftermath of the global financial crisis, or the aftermath of COVID even, particularly the global financial crisis, You would think that after the global financial crisis, there would be a resurgence of left-wing thought. There wasn't. And you've heard the phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste. And Naomi Klein talks about shock therapy or shock doctrine. So every time there's a crisis in the capitalist system, the ruling class uses it as an opportunity to further entrench neoliberalism or capitalism. Now, that's a recognition on the part of the political right that they're being presented a window of opportunity in which people are discombobulated by events. And so in this window of opportunity, they can force through political change. Whereas the left thinks, well, now's a good time to sit back and talk about what might be the right thing to do in 10, 20 years' time, because, don't remember that history is on our side. So I think this is an interesting point to critique the left from a realist perspective, because tend to be quite complacent, thinking that political opportunities will present themselves again and again and again. Whereas Geuss is saying, no, political opportunities only present themselves once. And the third question is the question of Weber, and that is, why should we act in one way rather than another? I've never read any Weber, so I was slightly less clear on this part. But basically, Weber thinks that people looking for reasons about why they do what they do are looking for legitimation. And Weber thought that societies were basically underpinned by implicit threats of violence, which legitimated the existing social order. That seems to me to be true. But again, I haven't read much Weber, so I'm not really clear on this point or this question of politics, which is why should we act in one way rather than another? What are the forces that tell us that we should, for example, observe or not observe the outcome of the most recent election? What are the legitimating forces in a society? And Geuss says these legitimating forces will be different in every different society at every different point in time. So again, he's connecting these questions with his earlier arguments that politics is a skill, politics is historically located, politics has to pay attention to actually existing institutions. So now we've got his three questions, his three realist questions of politics. With that in mind, what does Geuss think that the task of political theory is? Well, there are 5 tasks. It's understanding, evaluation, orientation, conceptual innovation, and finally ideology, which is the slightly more controversial one. So I'm going to spend more time on ideology. But just briefly, in the first instance, political theory can help us understand why things are the way they are. Why did X political party win the last election? It can help us evaluate why one policy or one political system might be better than the other. Thirdly, it can help us orient ourselves within a broader worldview. So they're all fairly straightforward. Conceptual innovation is it sometimes we're confused because we don't know what the problem is. We don't know how to ask the right questions because we don't have an understanding of the problem. And so political theory can help in these cases by introducing a new concept, by helping us look at the world in a different way. He gives the example of the state. But personally, I feel like a better example might be alienation. A lot of people don't like work. They don't like how they feel going to work, but they can't really articulate why that is. And so the concept of alienation would help them put their feelings and thoughts into words about why they don't like going to work. And that would be an instance of conceptual innovation, of political theory providing a concept that helps you understand politics, that helps you understand your place in the world. And lastly, he thinks political theory can either be used to promote a particular ideology, or it can be used to dissolve an ideology. Now, the definition of ideology that he uses has more in common with the Zizek theory of ideology, which is more pejorative in a sense. So I'll just read you a quote. That's probably the best way to get at this point. So he says, quote, "An ideology, then, is a set of beliefs, attitudes, preferences that are distorted as a result of the operation of specific relations of power. The distortion will characteristically take the form of presenting these beliefs, desires, etc., as inherently connected with some universal interest, when in fact they are subservient to particular interests. So the way ideology functions is it's a reflection of who has power in a society, and those with power through ideology make their unique interests appear as if they're in the interests of everyone. Now, just to give a contemporary example, in 2023, across most of the world, we have a slight return to inflation. So inflation's back after 20 years of basically being next to zero. And so the reserve banks all around the world, central banks all around the world are raising interest rates to try and push down inflation. And this is generally presented as being in the benefits of everyone. Now, obviously, inflation does hurt everyone, but it hurts some people more than others. And you might think it hurts poor people more than others, but that's not really true. Because how do we combat inflation? We push up interest rates, which hurts people who have mortgages. We suppress wages because we say, no, we don't want people spending and earning more money because that would make the problem worse. So we push down wages while we make people's mortgage repayments higher. But who's actually most hurt by inflation are the rich. Why is that? Because they have a lot of money in savings. And so if the value of the currency is eroding, the value of their money is eroding. And when interest rates go up, right, to push down inflation, they're accruing more interest on all that money that they have in a bank account. But more importantly, inflation is very, very bad for people who lend money. If I lend you $10,000 today, and then we have inflation for months or years at a time, and that loan is fixed, so it's not indexed to inflation, you're repaying me $10,000. If we have a high inflation environment, the money that you're repaying me is actually worth less in real terms than when I lent it to you. And that might be fine for you because if you have wage rises that keep up with inflation, you can keep repaying the loan quite easily. But the money that I'm getting back is worth less than what it was when I gave it to you. So people with enough money to loan it out actually are very, very harmed by inflation. And obviously, by definition, the rich have enough money to loan out lots of money. So this would be an example of when we talk about inflation as this societal challenge. Really, what we're doing is we're conflating basically the interests of loaners and people who give out money, banks, really. We're conflating their interests with the interests of everyone. And so the role of political theory for Geuss would be to make the point I just made and to expose how these particular interests are masquerading as universal interests. And he also gives a really, really interesting example, which is ideology, or political theory rather, can serve to propagate, to promote a certain ideology without ever saying anything false, empirically false. And so he gives this really interesting example of, think about a political actor who wants you to be very, very angry about how medical companies engage in price gouging. Pharmaceutical companies charging huge amounts of money for their products. Now, the political actor doing this is narrowing your attention very, very acutely on the problem of price gouging. And by narrowing your attention, you're not able to see the wider problem. By focusing on price gouging, you're assuming that it's natural that there's a market in healthcare. Because now you're just focusing on how the market functions. So you're not critiquing the fundamental assumption here that should there be a market in healthcare. So again, you're not saying anything empirically wrong when you focus on price gouging in healthcare. But you're still promoting or serving an ideology by not attacking the root problem, which is the existence of a market where perhaps there shouldn't be a market. So with that account of political realism in mind, where does Geuss think political realism has failed? That is to say, what are examples of looking at the world in which people are not sufficiently realistic, and what are the results? And so he goes through a number of concepts. And they are rights, justice, and equality. He says these ideas are instances of people not observing political realism. So if you've watched the episode that I did on John Rawls's theory of justice, this will make a lot of sense to you. So again, Rawls is beginning with an ideal theory, or he begins rather with a moral intuition that everyone has an innate sense of justice. That innate sense of justice is that people are free and equal, and therefore we should structure society according to that intuition. And Geuss says, well, hang on, intuitions are not eternal or universal, they're historically located. And so by beginning with that intuition, you're completely abdicating the question, why do people have that intuition? But more importantly, whose interests does that intuition serve? Is it the best intuition to have? Could we perhaps have a better intuition? But just by beginning with the intuition, you're not engaging in a politically realistic way. And so another one, or a follow-on example from that, is the idea of equality. And Geuss says the idea of equality is literally incoherent, right? What does he mean by this? You're never equal or unequal to someone else in the abstract. You're always equal or unequal in respect to some dimension. So you might be equal in terms of intelligence, but unequal in terms of physical power, or unequal in terms of your earning capacity, right? So you can't talk about equality in general. Furthermore, to make people equal along every dimension is literally an incoherent social goal, because if you were equal in every single dimension of your being, you wouldn't be different people anymore. You'd just be the one entity. So you can't talk about equality in the abstract. And this was actually what Marx and Engels said. I mean, they didn't like the idea of equality. And I think Marx called the concept of equal rights as verbal nonsense. And this was the reason why, because you can't take different people and slap equal, the label equal across all of them. In doing that, you're going to obscure the actual underlying differences. But he gives another interesting example of, say, a hospital. And the fact that you could either describe a hospital as being equal or unequal shows that it's completely useless to use the term equality in an abstract sense. A hospital is equal in the sense that everyone who needs medical care will get it, at least in Australia, but unequal in the sense that people who need more medical care, people who are more severely sick, will get more medical care. Not everyone gets the same amount of medical care, so they're unequal in that sense. And so the fact that you can describe the same situation as being either equal or unequal just shows that the concept itself in general is useless. You have to actually be talking about specific dimensions. So, okay, it sort of makes Geuss sound like, I don't know, not cold-hearted, but yeah, cold-hearted. He has no room for political moralism, and he's taken away all these political concepts that we talk about all the time. Talk about justice, equality, rights, etc. So what is politics then for Geuss? Politics is about power. And this is the core insight of political realism. It's the politics is about power. You might think that, like, as per Rawls, politics is about justice. And he says, well, politics might be about justice to the bureaucrat, to the administrator of society. But can you have administration without power? So the first political question is, who has power? Who sets up that power? Who creates the conditions for justice? That's the first political question. So he says, modern politics is importantly about power. It's acquisition, distribution, and use. If you want to think about politics, think first about power. And I love how he ends the book, because he says that George Lucas said, to be a Marxist is to use a certain method. So in principle, you could call yourself a Marxist without actually agreeing with what Marx said normatively, but you agree with how he studied politics. in that same sense, Geuss calls himself a Neo-Leninist. He doesn't agree with like the substantive content of Lenin's political program, but he agrees with how Lenin looked at politics. He looked at it as people, concrete people, exercising their power to do things to other people for someone's benefit. And in that sense, Geuss is a Neo-Leninist, which sounds controversial, but when you understand what he means, it's not that controversial. And he ends the book with this quote, which I think is really, really nice. He says, "Morality in post-Christian Europe is a huge intellectual and psychological apparatus that aims to simplify our world by dividing human actions into two dichotomous categories, good and evil, with nothing in between. It has little to tell us about real politics." Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please like, subscribe, comment. If I got something wrong, please do comment. Please let me know. If you have questions, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.